Well, let's get more perspective now on the issue of vaccine inequity. Joining me now is Dr. Wilmot James, Senior Research Scholar at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Columbia University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, and good day, good evening to the viewers.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I'd like to have you talk about the various stages that different countries and regions have reached globally with their vaccine rollouts.
Well, first of all, when it comes to vaccine rollouts concerning Africa, the rollout is quite poor. There's an average of about 3% of people vaccinated on the continent of Africa, with some variation in terms of countries and regions. As a whole, the rollout is weakest in the developing world compared to the developed world. So, but with the focus on Africa, the country that's doing the best is Morocco, followed by Tunisia, by Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Botswana. And so that's what the picture looks like presently.
And how has vaccine equity changed or progressed over the past year and a half?
Well, it's a grave situation. I mean, there was too much optimism in terms of what COVAX could do as the global entity. There was optimism about how many vaccines could come from northern countries. And so we presently sit in a situation where few of the countries in the developing world, and particularly in Africa, were incapable of having bilateral deals. South Africa was capable, Egypt, a handful of countries. The rest were dependent either on the African Union or dependent on COVAX. And there's just a massive choke on supply. And the situation has not improved, but it seems as if in the next 6 months, the picture will actually change quite dramatically.
So then talk about some of the key issues or challenges with the vaccine markets themselves in some of these countries that aren't able to produce vaccines or give people access to vaccines.
Well, if you think about Africa as a whole, there's not a single country that can produce an RNA technology-based vaccine. There are 4 countries involved presently in fill and finish. So the local production capacity is limited to South Africa, to Egypt, with some promise coming out of Morocco, possibly Senegal, and possibly Algeria. So the picture is simply that limited production capacity, a reliance on global supply agencies, and there's simply a choke on that supply. What is changing the picture is the upscaling of vaccine supplies coming out of China and coming out of Russia. And there's an increased commitment on the part of China to, in fact, upscale supply in a way that's actually quite dramatic. And we'll see some of the results of that in the next 6 months.
And we also did hear about Europe setting up some of these production hubs on the continent as well. What's the latest with vaccine production capacity and the rollout across the African continent?
Well, let me say that setting up RNA technology-based production, end-to-end production facilities on the African continent is going to take 2 to 3 years. It's not going to help at all with the present situation. What will help would be a fill and finish manufacturing capacity. There are 2 plants in South Africa that can do this. Egypt can do this. And there's a real potential for Morocco, Algeria, and possibly Senegal to do that too. But that's really limited. Africa will still depend in large part on vaccine diplomacy and essentially grants and gifts and aid from the north to up the supply. And the combination of those would make a difference.
And as you mentioned, some of these things take years. We know that in the past, sometimes they've had to reverse engineer vaccines because they weren't available and the patents weren't given. But in terms of the vaccine equity affecting people's abilities economically, what could we be looking at long term, being that some of these countries are so much further behind than others that are getting vaccinated?
Well, the problem with low vaccination rates is that it creates an opportunity for new variants to emerge. And that's quite a grave, difficult, complex situation. What that means in terms of public health strategy is that To the extent that vaccines arrive, they must get into people's arms, so that that part of the journey must be efficient in terms of logistics and distribution and actual vaccination. On the one hand, and on the other hand, there has to be reliance on public health social measures, non-pharmaceutical interventions. However, if you think about the African continent, the use of blunt instruments like lockdowns has been devastating economically, and they will continue to be devastating and drive the countries even further down in terms of economic performance. So what that means is that public health measures have to be implemented in a very smart way, a very targeted way, and a very local and regional way in order to contain the virus. And it's that combination that can in fact help. Upscaling vaccine supply, making sure it gets into people's arms, together with a smart application of social interventions. I believe that if we had the will to do that and the capability to do that, it will make a difference to mitigate the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic.